open with a gripping revelation about hidden wars that are not always fought in daylight or on open battlefields, but in shadows, in secret channels, and in unseen arenas. Connect the reality of today's rising conflict between Israel and Yemen's Houthis to the ancient pattern of unseen wars in Scripture. Wars of darkness versus light, powers behind thrones, conflicts that appear small but echo eternity. Set the stage by declaring that what we are witnessing is not just a regional skirmish, but a prophetic shadow war tied to biblical mysteries, the future of nations and God's purposes. It began in the highlands of Yemen, in places where the world rarely looked and where history seemed forgotten. A people who lived among mountains and valleys, marked by poverty and obscurity, began to stir. They were not a power known to the nations, nor a name that made the world tremble. Yet from the hidden corners of Arabia arose a movement that would one day shake the Middle East. The Houthis, born from grievances, born from the soil of struggle, began as a small uprising, a cry against corruption and neglect. But what begins as a whisper in the desert can become a storm that sweeps across nations. The world did not notice when they first took to arms. Few paid attention when they carried their chants through the villages and towns of Yemen. Yet behind them moved something greater, what met the eye. Weapons began to appear in their hands, drones and missiles that could strike far beyond their borders. Their reach grew longer, their ambitions wider. From being rebels in the mountains, they became a regional force, a proxy of powers far greater than themselves. The hand of Iran began to shape them, supplying not only arms but an ideology, the fire of an ancient struggle. And thus, what was once a localized rebellion in a forgotten land turned into an arm of a greater shadow war. Yemen, often dismissed as the edge of the map, became a stage in the drama of the Middle East. It was as if the forgotten had become the center, the neglected had become the focus, the hidden had become revealed. And is this not the way it has always been? In the Scriptures, again and again, it is the smallest that shakes the greatest, the weakest that unsettles the mighty. A shepherd boy stands against a giant. A remnant nation rises in the midst of empires. A small lamp lights the darkness of kingdoms. So too in our time, a forgotten people in the highlands of Arabia emerge as a force that now challenges Israel itself. From these mountains, missiles have flown over seas, drones have sloughed out distant cities, and warships have been threatened on the waters. The Houthis, once thought powerless, now speak with weapons that can alter the balance of nations. The eyes of the world, once indifferent, now turn toward Yemen, not because of its riches or greatness, but because of the fire that has been kindled there. And that fire is not simply political or military. It is ideological, it is spiritual, it is the continuation of ancient conflicts, the clash of kingdoms, the echo of struggles that began long ago. For the Houthis do not speak merely of Yemen. They speak in the language of defiance, in the voice of war against Israel, in the rhetoric of destruction against the Jewish state. A people hidden in valleys now declare war on the nation that has stood at the center of prophecy. And what does that reveal? That the battles of this age are not merely about land or politics. They are about something deeper, about ancient enmities, about forces that have always risen against the purposes of God. Thus, the Houthis are not merely rebels of Yemen. They have become part of a greater mystery, a greater war, one that stretches from Persia to Arabia to Israel. They are a reminder that no place is too small to play a role in the unfolding of prophecy, no people too hidden to be drawn into the storm. A spark in the desert can become a flame that lights the world stage, and the cries of a forgotten people can become the battle cries that reach the gates of Jerusalem. The waters of the Red Sea have always carried a mystery. Long ago, it was here that the children of Israel stood trapped, pressed between the sea and the might of Pharaoh's armies. It was here that the impossible became possible, where the waters parted and a nation walked through on dry ground. It was here that God revealed His power, turning the sea into a passage of salvation for His people and a grave for their pursuers. That same body of water, which once bore witness to the deliverance of Israel, has now become the stage of another conflict, one that again entwines Israel with the nations that rise against it. In our day, those same waters have become a battlefield, not with chariots and horses, but with missiles and drones. The Houthis of Yemen, from their mountains, reach out across the Red Sea, targeting ships, striking at vessels that pass through one of the most vital lifelines of the world. For the Red Sea is not just a body of water. It is the highway of nations, the passage of commerce, the channel that links east to west. The trade of continents flows through its waves. Oil, goods, supplies, the lifeblood of economies. And now that passage is threatened as missiles arc across its skies and explosions break its silence. The Houthis strike at ships as Pharaoh once pursued Israel. They disrupt the waters as his armies once rushed into the sea. They seek to choke the passage, to block the way, to bring fear to the nations. What was once the scene of deliverance has become the arena of conflict. And yet the pattern is the same. As Israel once stood at the edge of the waters, so now Israel is linked to the battles of the Red Sea. For though the targets may be ships of other nations, though the commerce belongs to the world, at the heart of this storm is Israel. The Houthis themselves declare it. Their missiles, their drones, their rhetoric, all point to Israel as the ultimate enemy. And here lies the mystery. What appears to be attacks on shipping lanes is more than commerce disrupted. It is more than economics or trade. It is a war that touches on prophecy, on the ancient struggle of those who have sought to cut off Israel from life, to block its way, to surround it in the wilderness. The Red Sea was once the place where God made way when there was no way, where He turned back the hand of those who sought to destroy His people. And now again, the Red Sea has become a dividing line, a place where the destinies of nations are being tested. The world sees insurance rates rise, markets shake, and ships rerouted around Africa. But the deeper reality is that the same waters that bore witness to Israel's salvation are once again bound to its struggle. Pharaoh's armies drowned in those depths, and yet the spirit of Pharaoh continues, rising in new forms, in new empires, in new movements. The Houthis, armed by Iran, cry out with the same intent: to strike Israel, to block its path, to undo its future. But just as before, the waters of the Red Sea stand as witness. They are not only waters of trade, but waters of prophecy. They remind us that the God who parted them once has not ceased to move in the currents of history. So the attacks of the Houthis are more than piracy, more than political maneuvering. They are part of the shadow war that stretches back to the days when Pharaoh sought to enslave Israel and destroy it at the edge of the sea. They are signs that the struggles of old are not finished, but continue to echo into our time. And what unfolds in those waters is not only about nations and markets, but about the destiny of Israel, the survival of God's people, and the revealing of His hand in the storms of the last days in the mountains of Yemen. The Houthis fire their missiles and launch their drones. But behind those weapons lies another hand. Their chants may rise from Sana'a, but the echoes carry from Tehran. The world calls them rebels, but they are not alone. They are armed, funded, and guided by a greater power, by a nation whose reach has spread like a shadow across the Middle East. Iran, the modern Islamic Republic, yet bearing the spirit of an ancient empire, moves in the darkness of this war. For the Houthis are not merely fighting their own battles, they are the outstretched arm of Persia. From Lebanon, Hezbollah rises with rockets pointed toward Israel. From Gaza, Hamas unleashes terror. From Syria, militias wait in the shadows. And from Yemen, the Houthis strike across seas. All different groups, different lands, different names, yet tied together by one hand, one strategy, one empire seeking to surround a nation and choke it. Iran seeks to encircle Israel from the north, the south, the east, and even from the distant west through the seas. This is not a war of chance. It is a design, a web carefully woven, a shadow that reaches from the ancient past into the present moment. For Persia is not a name new to Israel. Long ago it was Persia that rose as a mighty empire, stretching its rule across the world, holding dominion over lands and peoples. Persia was there in the days of Daniel. Persia issued decrees concerning Jerusalem. Persia played its part in the destinies of God's people. And the shadow of that empire has never truly vanished. Now in modern form it has remerged. The Islamic Republic calls itself Iran, yet its ancient root is Persia. And just as Persia once sought dominion across the lands, so too now does Iran stretch its influence across the Middle East. But beneath the politics, beneath the weapons, lies something deeper, a spiritual war. For what we see on the surface is the outworking of a struggle far older than Iran or Israel, far older than Persia or the modern world. It is the ancient war against the purposes of God, the conflict of kingdoms, the enmity declared long ago between the seed of the woman and the forces that rise against it. Iran, with all its power and ambition, becomes another vessel of that conflict, another empire echoing the role of those before it. Babylon fell, Assyria crumbled, Persia faded, yet the spirit of those empires rises again in new names, new banners, new forms. So when the Houthis launch their missiles, when they declare war against Israel, it is not only their voices we hear. It is the voice of a greater strategy, the hand of Iran reaching across lands. It is the shadow of Persia still moving in the earth. And prophecy speaks of these things, that in the last days nations would conspire against Israel, that enemies would gather from every side, that powers ancient and modern would rise together in one purpose. The Houthis are but one piece of this greater design, one pawn in a larger war. Thus the struggle is not only about Yemen, nor only about Israel, but about something transcendent. It is the convergence of ancient prophecies and modern wars, of spiritual forces moving through empires and nations. The hand of Persia reaches through Yemen, through Lebanon, through Gaza, but the true battle is not against flesh and blood. It is the battle of thrones, of dominions, of principalities, the war that has raged since Eden. And the shadow that lingers from Persia's past is now part of the greater picture, unfolding before our eyes. The picture of a world aligning, of enemies surrounding Israel, and of prophecy moving toward its appointed end. What unfolds in the Middle East is not only a clash of armies and weapons, nor merely a struggle of politics and power. Beneath the missiles and drones, beneath the strategies of generals and the ambitions of nations, lies a deeper war. A war of covenants, promises, and destinies. For Israel is not like other nations. It was not born as an empire of men or a kingdom of human ambition. It was called forth by the voice of God, birthed by a promise, sustained by a covenant. And because of that, every battle against Israel carries a significance beyond what the eyes can see. From the very beginning, the nations rose against this people. Amalek came from the shadows to strike them as they journeyed through the wilderness. Philistia rose to challenge them in their land. Moab, Edom, Assyria, Babylon, all took their turns, seeking to erase the name of Israel from the earth. But it was never just about land or power. It was about something greater, something spiritual. For to war against Israel was to war against the covenant, against the purposes of God, against the promise that through this people would come blessing to all nations. And so it is no accident that in our day the same pattern continues. New names rise: Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, yet the spirit is the same. Amalek rises again, Philistia takes new form, the ancient enmities find new vessels. The Houthis, hidden in the mountains of Yemen, launch their weapons toward Israel. They speak the same words of destruction, echoing the ancient voices that once vowed to cut off the nation. But just as in ages past, what they wage is not merely a war of men. It is the shadow of a greater war, the echo of an ancient hostility. This war is written in the heavens, inscribed in prophecy. From Genesis it was foretold there would be enmity between the seed of the woman and the serpent. That enmity runs through the pages of history, manifesting in Pharaoh, who sought to drown the children, in Haman, who plotted annihilation, in Antiochus, who defiled the temple, in Rome, that scattered the people. And now, in the age of missiles and drones, that same enmity rises again. The names change, the weapons change, the lands change, but the spirit remains. Israel is not merely fighting for survival, as other nations do. It is standing in the center of a cosmic battle, a battle that stretches beyond time, a battle between the purposes of heaven and the powers of darkness. When the Houthis strike, they are not only striking a nation of this world, they are striking against the covenant of God. And yet, every time such forces rise, they meet the same truth, that the covenant stands, that the promise remains, that the purposes of God cannot be overturned. The warfare of our time is both earthly and heavenly. On earth, drones and rockets light up the skies. In heaven, prophecy and destiny move toward their fulfillment. And the shadow war in Yemen is part of this mystery, that what seems small and distant is bound to the eternal, that what seems political is in fact spiritual, that the ancient war written in Scripture is still unfolding before our very eyes. For Amalek has risen again, Philistia speaks again, Persia moves again, and yet Israel remains, because the covenant of God remains. The battles of our day do not remain confined to the deserts or the mountains where they begin. What happens in the hidden places of Yemen, what rises against Israel in the Red Sea, sends shockwaves that travel far beyond the Middle East. For the Red Sea is not only a border between lands, it is a lifeline of nations. Through its waters passes the oil that fuels economies, the goods that stock markets, the supplies that feed nations. Ships that traverse its lanes connect Asia to Europe, the East to the West, the factories of one continent to the consumers of another. It is one of the arteries of the world. And now, that artery has been struck. The Houthis launch their missiles into its waters, send their drones against its ships, and the entire world feels the tremors. Tankers are delayed, goods are rerouted around Africa, oil prices rise, markets falter. What began as a shadow war in the mountains of Yemen now reaches into the gas pumps of Europe, the supermarkets of America, the factories of Asia. The world may not see the connection, but what happens in those narrow waters of the Red Sea is already shaping the lives of billions. It is a mystery as old as the Scriptures. For what happens with Israel has never been confined to Israel alone. When Egypt rose against it, the fate of empires was decided. When Babylon came against it, the destinies of nations shifted. When Rome struck against it, the world itself was altered. Israel has always been at the center, the stage upon which the dramas of history and prophecy unfold. And so it is now. The shadow war that touches Israel ripples outward, shaking economies, governments, and nations across the earth. The nations look at the Red Sea and see only commerce, only trade. But the Word reveals it as more. A place where God once displayed His power, a place bound to the destiny of His people. Pharaoh's armies once perished there, and now again the enemies of Israel reach into its waters. And as they do, the impact is felt not only in Jerusalem, but in London, in Beijing, in New York. The shipping lanes of the Red Sea become the fault lines of the world, the pressure points through which prophecy touches the nations. For the truth is this: no nation can escape the reverberations of the war against Israel. The war may seem distant, but its effects arrive in every land. The Scriptures tell us that Israel is the apple of God's eye, the nation chosen to be a sign among the nations. Therefore, every hand lifted against it shakes more than borders. It shakes economies. It unsettles governments. It reverberates through the systems of the world. What begins as a missile launched from Yemen, what begins as a drone flying over the Red Sea, becomes a ripple that touches the shelves of stores across the earth. The ancient land where God revealed His covenant now becomes the pivot point of global commerce. Prophecy entwined with economics, destiny entwined with trade. This is the mystery unfolding, that the war against Israel is never just against Israel. It is a war that draws in the nations, shakes their stability, tests their foundations. And it is a reminder that all history moves according to a greater hand, that the world cannot sever itself from Israel, for Israel remains at the center of prophecy and the stage upon which the destinies of nations turn. The shadow war is not waged only with weapons that can be seen, nor fought only on the ground of deserts or upon the waters of seas. It is also a war of words, of ideas, of voices crying out with hatred. In the streets of Yemen, the Houthis lift up their chants. Death to Israel. Death to America. They raise their slogans as banners, declaring destruction upon nations they have never seen, speaking curses upon peoples they have never touched. And yet their voices are familiar, for they are not new. They echo through the corridors of time, the same cry that has risen again and again against the people of God. It was heard in Egypt when Pharaoh decreed the death of the Hebrew children. It was voiced in Babylon when Nebuchadnezzar sought to erase Jerusalem. It was whispered in Persia when Haman plotted annihilation. It was proclaimed in Rome when legions marched to scatter the nation and burn the temple. Each time, the hatred clothed itself in the language of empires, kings, armies, and decrees. But behind it was something older, darker, deeper. For behind every earthly enemy that has risen against Israel, there has always been another enemy, the adversary of souls, the one who wars not only against Israel, but against the covenant, against the purposes of God Himself. The Houthis may shout their curses with human tongues, but the hatred they channel is not born merely of politics or nationalism. It is part of a spiritual war. The adversary seeks to destroy what God has chosen, to silence the witness of the covenant, to erase the nation that stands as a testimony to His faithfulness. That is why throughout history, the same enmity resurfaces in different forms, in different lands, through different vessels. Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, Haman, Antiochus, Rome, each became the instrument of that same hostility. And now, in the age of missiles and drones, that same spirit finds voice in the Houthis, in their chants, in their threats, in their war. This is the true nature of the shadow war. It is not only physical, but ideological. It is not only against Israel as a nation, but against Israel as a sign, a covenant, a chosen people. The hatred is not only of flesh against flesh, but of darkness against light, of the adversary against the plan of redemption. That is why the chant, "Death to Israel," is inseparable from "Death to America." For America, despite its flaws, has stood as Israel's ally and thus becomes a target of the same enmity. The hatred is not random. It is focused, directed, ancient. The scriptures tell us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, rulers of darkness, spiritual hosts of wickedness. The shadow war makes this visible. Behind the rockets are rulers of darkness. Behind the drones are principalities. Behind the chants are spiritual powers. The visible is only the surface. The invisible is the true battle. And so, when we hear the cries from Yemen, when we see the missiles fly across the Red Sea, we are witnessing more than geopolitics. We are seeing the manifestation of a cosmic conflict. The adversary still wars against God by warring against His people. The hatred that burned in Pharaoh, in Babylon, in Haman, in Rome, now burns in movements like the Houthis. And yet, as in every age, the purposes of God stand unmoved. The adversary rages, but the covenant remains. The shadow war rages on earth, but in truth, it is part of the great war in the heavens, the conflict that began long before Yemen or Israel. And that will end only when the kingdoms of this world become the kingdom of the Lord. The prophets spoke of days when the nations would gather against Israel, when forces from the ends of the earth would conspire to strike the land and the people of the covenant. Ezekiel saw the vision of Gog and Magog, of a confederation rising from the north, joined by peoples from distant lands, marching with one purpose, to come against Israel in the latter days. Zechariah declared that all nations would be gathered against Jerusalem, that the city would be surrounded, that the world itself would be drawn into the final conflict. These were not vague words. They were visions of a future in which the war against Israel would not be local but global, not occasional but climactic. And now, as we look at the shadow war unfolding in our time, we see the threads of these prophecies taking form. The Houthis of Yemen may seem small, hidden, insignificant compared to the empires of old, yet their war is not isolated. They are one strand woven into a larger tapestry. Their missiles across the Red Sea are not only against ships, they are part of a growing encirclement. Their chants of death to Israel join the chorus already heard in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Tehran, and Damascus. Piece by piece, nation by nation, group by group, the prophetic picture takes shape. Israel surrounded, pressed from every side. Ezekiel named Persia among the nations that would stand in the confederation against Israel. Persia is Iran, and Iran's hand reaches into Lebanon through Hezbollah, into Gaza through Hamas, into Syria through militias, into Yemen through the Houthis. These are not disconnected fires. They are branches of one flame, the rising of powers foretold. What the prophets saw, we now witness. Small powers, hidden movements, rising forces preparing the ground for a greater war. And it is not only Ezekiel. Zechariah spoke of Jerusalem as the heavy stone immovable, a stone that all nations would seek to lift and be crushed in the attempt. He foresaw the gathering of armies, the circling of nations, the global storm converging upon Israel. What do we see in our day? Nations at the United Nations rising against Israel, resolutions passed, condemnations declared, boycotts called. The physical war is joined by the political war, the ideological war, the spiritual war. And even in the mountains of Yemen, that war joins the chorus. The shadow war is not the final war. It is the prelude. It is the assembling of the pieces, the stirring of the forces, the gathering of the storm. A hidden group in Yemen launches missiles across seas. But it is part of something cosmic, something written long ago. For when the prophets saw the end, they saw not only the great armies, but the rising of nations from every corner, the convergence of all who would oppose God's covenant people. Thus the Houthis are not an anomaly. They are a sign, a reminder that the tapestry of prophecy is weaving itself together before our eyes. That no movement, however hidden, is outside the purposes of the larger war. That what was spoken by Ezekiel, what was revealed through Zechariah, is moving closer with each strike, with each chant, with each rising hostility. The shadow war is one thread in the divine pattern, preparing the stage for the greater conflict, the end, time convergence. The day when the nations will surround Jerusalem, and when the hand of God will again be revealed. The shadow war is not only about Israel and Yemen, nor only about politics and nations. It is also about us. For what unfolds in the Middle East is not distant from the lives of those who believe. The scriptures tell us to be watchmen, to discern the times, to understand the signs. And what are these days if not signs? Missiles and drones fill the headlines. Economies tremble. Nations take their sides. But behind it all moves another hand. The hand of God, weaving prophecy, guiding history, calling his people to awaken. Israel is not just another nation on the map. It is the root, the covenant, the sign. From Israel came the word. From Israel came the Messiah. From Israel came the gospel, that reach the ends of the earth. To watch Israel is to watch the clock of prophecy. The nations may see only conflict, but believers are called to see the mystery. For when Israel is surrounded, when the nations rage, when hidden wars rise from Yemen to Gaza to Lebanon, it is a sign that the great story of redemption is moving forward. What then does it mean for us? It means vigilance. It means we cannot live as if these days were ordinary. We must see with spiritual eyes. We must not be distracted by the noise of the world or dulled by the comfort of daily life. We are called to discern the hour. The shadow war reminds us that the battle is not against flesh and blood, and that prayer is not optional, but essential. Intercession becomes warfare. Alignment with God's purposes becomes our shield. It is not enough to watch the news. We must watch the hand behind the news. Nations rise and fall, alliances shift, weapons are fired. But above it all the Lord reigns. He has declared the end from the beginning. He has promised that Israel will not be destroyed. He has promised that every weapon formed against his covenant will fail. But he has also called his people to stand, to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, to intercede for the salvation of the nations, to be awake as the days grow darker. For what happens in Israel is bound to what happens to the church. If the root is holy, so are the branches. If the covenant stands, so does the hope of all who believe. When Israel is attacked, it is because the enemy wars against the covenant. And that covenant is the foundation of our faith. To pray for Israel is not only to pray for a nation, but to pray in alignment with the purposes of God that brought salvation to the world. So this shadow war is a call to the watchmen, to the intercessors, to the faithful. A call to lift our eyes beyond the visible, to discern the invisible, to be found awake when the world is asleep. It is a call to vigilance, to prayer, to stand firm in faith. For the times are moving, prophecy is unfolding, and the battles of Israel are not far from us. They are connected to the destiny of the body of Messiah, to the redemption that is drawing near, and to the hour when the Lord himself will arise and be revealed. Though the missiles fly, though the chants of hatred echo from the mountains of Yemen, though the shadow war stretches across seas and skies, the throne of God has not moved. He remains sovereign. The nations rage, but he who sits in the heavens laughs. The enemies of Israel gather, but the covenant remains. For what empire has ever endured when it set itself against the people of God? Egypt rose in its power, yet its armies drowned in the sea. Babylon shone in its glory, yet it turned to dust. Rome wielded its legions, yet it crumbled into ruin. The names have changed: Amalek, Philistia, Babylon, Persia, Rome, Nazis, Houthis. But the end is always the same. The enemies fade, the covenant remains, and Israel endures. This is the mystery of history, that the smallest of nations, the most persecuted of peoples, has outlived every empire that sought its destruction. Pharaoh is gone, but Israel lives. Haman is remembered only for his fall, but Israel lives. Hitler's Reich is no more, but Israel lives. The Houthis will pass, Iran will falter. Every weapon raised against Israel will one day be broken, but Israel will live, because the God of Israel lives. It was he who parted the Red Sea and made a way when there was no way. It was he who brought his people back from Babylon. It was he who preserved them through dispersion and exile, who kept them through centuries of persecution, who brought them back to their land after 2,000 years, who preserved them through the Holocaust, and who raised them again as a nation among the nations. And it is He who will preserve them now. For the covenant was not broken, the promise not erased, the word not undone. So when we hear of missiles, when we see the shadow war, when the nations rise in fury, we must not lose hope. The darker the night, the brighter the light shines. The more the shadows grow, the more certain it is that the dawn is coming. The story does not end with the triumph of Ariel's enemies, but with the fulfillment of God's word. The same scriptures that spoke of Israel's scattering also spoke of its regathering. And it has come to pass. The same prophets who saw the nations rise also saw the day when the Lord himself would come, when his feet would stand upon the Mount of Olives, when his kingdom would cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. This is the hope. The shadow war is real, but the light is greater. The adversary rages, but the covenant stands. The powers of darkness move, but the hand of God moves greater still. We are called not to fear, but to watch, not to despair, but to hope, not to shrink back, but to stand firm in faith. For the end of the story has already been written. And it does not end in the fall of Israel, but in the triumph of the Lord, the faithfulness of his covenant, and the revelation of his kingdom.